see if I got this right. We press, what do we press here? The green one. Oh, the big green one, obviously. Yes, I'm going to present some data from the Australian homicide study, which is, I want to acknowledge my collaborators in this study. Paul Mazerol is the IP. Lee Erickson and Holly Johnson are also part of this. Let me talk a little bit about it. The project's been going for a few years now, and it's a large-scale study with a comprehensive range to it, funded by the ARC and run through Griffith. It involves structured face-to-face interviews conducted in correctional facilities around Australia. So we're trying to get a national sample. These interviews were very detailed and very comprehensive. I'll show you a bit more data on what they contain later. We ended up with a sample of 302 offenders, and we divided them into various categories so that we could compare across different kind of homicide categories. So what was covered, there are basically three components to the study. We collected a whole lot of background data. These are socio-demographic stuff. We had quite a few psychological scales, scales on self-control, scales on attitudes to women, a whole range of things. This is probably the area that we've done the most analysis in. We have, I think, around 8 or so publications so far that have come from that range of data. A unique aspect of the study is what we're interested in is not just trying to get static measures of how different kinds of offenders differed from each other. We're interested in trying to unpack or unfold the events that led up to the offence. And we did this at 2 stages. We wanted to know, were there significant events in the last 12 months leading up to the offence that we could trace and see a sort of a culmination, the murder as a culmination of those events. So that's the calendar there, number 2. And again, this is a very, very detailed analysis. In many cases took an hour or so to collect these data from the sample. And you can see the sort of things we're looking at. What were their housing situations, what were their relationship situations, substance abuse. And we got more and more detailed the closer we got to the event. And the final component, the bit I want to talk about today, are the situational aspects. And this is basically the day of the offence. What happened there? Our hypothesis was that very, very few offenders wake up in the morning and say, I think I'll kill someone today. Something evolved over that day, and we wanted to unpack that. We wanted to see the unfolding of events that culminated in the homicide. So we looked at 2 things. We looked at 3 things. We looked at the events leading up. We looked at the event itself, what happened, and then we looked at what happened afterwards. And as I said, this is a combination of direct questions, but we also wanted to give the sample, people in the sample, an opportunity just to explain themselves. So a lot of the data that we collected, actually very new for me, it's not the sort of data I normally collect, is getting them to tell the story. And then we went through and coded that, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. So this is just a breakdown of the whole sample. As I said, 302 homicide offenders. The majority were males, 262, 40 female. And then we separated them out. Our main set of analyses are between intimate partner and other kinds. These are the data I'm going to focus on, but I'm going to focus only on male offenders. So my sample today comprises 262 offenders, 69 of the male offenders, 69 of whom committed intimate partner homicide, and 193 who committed other sorts of homicides. I'm going to just go through and show some findings for these variables. We looked at some personal variables just to contextualise it. The offender age, for example, previous contact with the law, self-control scores, emotional state, the week leading up to the event, and then a range of situational variables. Again, as I said, some of these collected simply by asking direct questions, but most of them collected through analysing the free responses that offenders gave us. So their gender, how long they'd known the victim, the degree of planning and forethought, and you can read this as well as I can, those sorts of things. So I'm just going to go through those variables now. Here we go. So we're interested in just their previous contact with the legal system at various stages, and you can see here a comparison between intimate partner and other. We looked at two things: proportion of the sample that had involvement with the criminal justice system and the age of onset. As a general summary of those data, you can see there's a fairly significant involvement, up to half of the offenders, and in some cases over half the offenders, had some kind of formal relationship. And it tended to be somewhat stronger amongst the other offenders than the intimate partner. And I think we can probably intuit that would be the finding. Again, in terms of age of onset, around 13, 14 for some of those contacts. Age at the time of the offence, just simply compare them, and again, we'd probably predict that the intimate partner tended to be older than the other kinds of offenders, and that's true. We also gave them self-control scale. This reads backwards, so the higher the score, the lower the self-control, and we found that there was lower levels of self-control amongst the other group. I reanalysed this using age as a covariate to control for that, and this gap diminished considerably. So a lot of this effect I think we can attribute to the fact that the sample is younger. So we're interested in their emotional state leading up to the offence, the week leading up. And again, you can see fairly high levels of emotional disturbance or reporting emotional problems. And particularly for the intimate partner, slightly higher levels there. 50% of the, 50% of the other sample was fine, no particular difficulties, but sad, depressed, tended to be higher amongst the intimate partner. So let's just unpack some of the situational variables. And as I said before, a lot of this was gained by just getting the participants to talk. I've selected a few examples here. These were what I could fit onto a slide. Many of the responses of our participants were much longer than this. They gave us quite a lot of detail. And it was really fascinating to read through them. Just reading them and seeing how waking up in the morning resulted in an offence, a murder, 2, 3, 5, 7 hours later. It was a fascinating thing to unpack. So I've just tried to give some examples. I've divided them into intimate partner and other, and I've had 3 stages. Some of them were, in the words of the offender, entirely unplanned, in the sense that they got into a fight and the events proceeded straight away without much forethought. And this is an example of this for intimate partner homicide. You can briefly read through. But basically, they're having breakfast, they get into a fight, and before he knows it, he's strangled his wife. This is what I've called semi-planned. These tend to happen where there's a gap between the anger and the offence. So in this case, he got really angry with his wife, but he had time then to go out and get a gun, get it out of the boot of his car, then go and shoot her. So semi-planned is the way I've talked about this, and that's how it unfolds there. I apologise for the amount of detail there. I just want to give you some sense of what we were dealing with. And this is fully planned. This is where I realised when I sent these slides in that this is actually a female offender, but nevertheless it demonstrates the case. She's been a victim of DV for some time and makes a conscious decision to kill her husband and enlists her flatmate to do that. And then if we looked at the other, again, unplanned cases, this is someone who gets into a fight and kills someone in the process of that. And what I've called semi-planned, This is someone who picks up a woman, rapes her, and then consciously decides to kill her because he's worried that he'll get caught. Any speed readers, I think you might be getting there, but I'm going to just push on anyway. And this one's quite planned. This is a drug deal, and they seem to have gone into this. They've taken a gun with them, and it seems that the offender knows from the outset that he's going to use the gun and shoot the person, makes that conscious decision. If I can direct you to some bits of this, you might want to just look at the last little bit. I love the logic here, where he's, classic kind of Sykes neutralisations, framing it as actually doing the offender a favour because, the victim a favour, because the last thing he'd want to do is leave him disfigured. We looked at gender by offence type. This is, again, unsurprising. Most of the victims in the intimate partner were female, and these are male offenders. You can't... Oh, crikey, I'll go back. You can't see it here, but there is, in fact, one or two male victims here. How long had you known the victim? Well, obviously we'd assume for intimate partner they'd known for some time, and that's in fact the case. But even with the other kinds of offenders, the modal kind of situation was that in what's that, about 40, 75, 3/4 to 80% of the cases, they'd known the victim for some time. So these are reinforcing things I guess we know about homicide generally, that they tend to occur between people who have pre-existing relationships, with relatively few exceptions to that. These are exceptions to the rule rather than the rule itself. We asked them about forethought and planning, and again, these were a mix of direct questions and then getting them to verbalise the extent to which they'd done that. And again, you can see these. In both cases, in about a fifth of the case, they'd been having violent thoughts about the victim for some time. These are people who said they made a conscious decision to hurt the victim. And these are people who said they made concrete plans. They took steps and forethought into committing the offence. Some differences between the two, mainly around here. The conscious decision to hurt, more predominant here in the other category. So, how long had these thoughts occurred? So again, violent thoughts, decision to hurt, and plan to kill. Well, in some cases, for some time, for more than a year, people had violent thoughts, or certainly in the year leading up to it. Much more so for intimate partner homicide than the other. Quite a few are saying, though, that it was more or less at the moment or on the same day. If we look at the actual decision to hurt, again, the majority in this case, and almost majority here, are saying that the decision was more or less spontaneous, or at least on that day. But some examples of more detailed planning. And concrete plans to kill, again, even within the domestic violence, we have people who are saying they've been thinking about doing this, making plans for a year, about 10% of the sample. About a quarter of the others are saying for more than a year they've been harbouring these plans. But the modal response, by and large, about a third are saying that the plans occurred more or less spontaneously at the time. And some, as you can see, some slight differences between the two groups. We're interested in their feelings before, just before the offence. And again, so if you remember back, most were saying, or about a third to half were saying that they felt okay in the week leading up. On the day of the offence, just before the offence, they're much more less likely to say that they were feeling fine. And by and large, we see, I guess, slightly greater levels of disturbance amongst the intimate partner group than the other offenders. The involvement in alcohol, well, we know these data from elsewhere. I was perhaps a little surprised, though, that alcohol and drugs played a greater part in the other offenders than for intimate partner. And we certainly see lots of examples where the intimate partner homicides occurred during drinking sessions and so forth, but if you look overall, slightly less likely to happen, or in fact significantly less likely. We looked at the time of day. Not a great deal here except to say that other was more likely to occur in the evening, and intimate partner, I guess again not surprisingly, in the smaller hours of the day and through the day. Location of the offence. In both cases, the most common location was residence, homes of the offender or the victim. More likely, obviously, I think for domestic offenders, we'd predict that, and correspondingly, slightly more likely that non-domestic offending occurred in public and then in other sort of commercial and government premises. Sometimes for intimate partner, this is often examples of stalking, where you follow the partner to work and the murder, homicide occurs there. We're very interested in the type of weapon. I think a couple of things to point out here. If we think about formal weapons, knives and firearms, they comprise significantly less than 50%, about just over 40%, a little less there. Again, we asked them about this in a free response, and it was interesting the extent to which people found weapons, improvised weapons. In some of these cases, for example, these were rocks that happened to be standing by, or happened to be by them, or a stick or something like that. Other sharp objects, things like scissors and the like. So as I say, often improvised weapons that tended to be at hand, which feeds into the somewhat impulsive nature of many of these offending. And the source of the weapon by offender type, so we asked them where the weapon came from. In many cases, no weapon. Brought for self-defence. Was handy was the largest category. Brought to use. So relatively few seem to arrive at the murder scene with a weapon ready to commit a crime. And then we asked them why they didn't stop. In the case of intimate partner, they were saying that they lost control, and this was evident in many of the discussions or many of the descriptions they had of their offence. Some other notable things. Some did stop, but the person had died without them realising it. A few quite frankly said that they wanted to finish the job. They saw the person injured, and then they wanted to go. They took a conscious decision to go the whole way. Establishing control. This was often about the partner feeling that they were being cheated on by their wife, and they wanted to kind of get back at her for that. And again, I guess differences between them, slightly more calculating, I guess, for the non-intimate partner group. Okay, so let's summarise the results. What I was struck by, looking particularly at the responses of the free responses of the sample, is just how varied and complex the events leading up to the offence were. And as I said, in very few cases Was it a situation where the person had woken up in that morning knowing that they were going to kill someone by the end of the day? It's how that day unfolded that seemed to be the crucial thing. And how that unfolded varied considerably amongst the sample. The intimate partner homicides are generally less criminally involved, somewhat older and slightly more self-control, so they have slightly different socio-demographic backgrounds and psychological backgrounds. We found high levels of emotional disturbance among most groups, but particularly the intimate partner homicide group. Most crimes occur between people with established relationships, by definition in the intimate partner homicide group, but even so for the other offenders as well. In about a third of the case was there no discernible planning. Alcohol and drugs an offence, especially in the other group. The offences, whether they're intimate partner homicide or other, mostly occurred in domestic settings. And less than half involved a formal weapon, what we would, something that's described as a weapon, if you like, or its purpose as a weapon. And the most common thing was to improvise things that were handy. Well, so what? So my main interest is in crime prevention, and in particular situational crime prevention. So my motive in being involved in this project, and particularly in looking at the situational aspects, is to see if we could get some angles on how we could intervene with homicide at a situational level. So overwhelmingly, of course, the most common way we would intervene with homicide is try to do something about the offender. But if we accept that all crime, including homicide, is a function of a person-situation interaction, and I think what came out most for me was how true that was when I kind of saw the way the person had navigated through that day, then what we want to get is some clues about how we can change those situations that are leading to the offence. And I've got to say, that proves a challenge with a crime like homicide. I think we'd have to admit that situational prevention is much easier to operationalise when we have set locations. So if we want to stop theft from an ATM, we can do something at the ATM because that's where the crime's going to occur. What we find here is that homicide is a very mobile offence, can occur anywhere. So how do we intervene at a situational level there when we don't know where the situation is going to be? So that is a challenge, and it's something I've been giving some thought to. I don't think it's impossible not to implement, or it's impossible to implement situational measures. We know we can do it for sex offending, for example. But my thinking here is still, I guess, very much embryonic. And again, I'd perhaps welcome some suggestions from the audience. One thing that occurred to me is that what the results do show is that to some extent weapon control may well be effective. The fact that we had relatively few homicides being carried out with guns and even knives might be some sign that the lack of ready access to a weapon might already be shown here. But I acknowledge it is difficult to then use the same logic to control improvised weapons. Incidentally, we're facing this in London now with knife crime because it seems pretty difficult to restrict people's access to knives because they've got to cut bread and things like that. Although what they're finding there is that there are particular knives that are being used in the knife crime in London, and many of those are really pretty obviously designated as weapons and things that people get off the internet and so forth. So still thinking about that, some of the other areas that we might think about in terms of prevention, though, are some areas that we would think of anyway. As I said, one of the things that became apparent is the association, particularly in the intimate partner homicide group, of emotional disturbances and also obvious friction between the husband and the wife, or the partner and the wife. And so we might give some of our attention to these sort of red flags. So some of the work that's already being done in the DV space, I think, plays into this. And similarly, the role of drug and alcohol, I think we can stitch this together with some of the work done in the prevention in that area. But I'd be very interested to hear if you had other suggestions. So thank you.
questions for Richard?
Oh, no. Okay.
No, it's okay, Richard.
You've got to wait for the mic, Don. It's over there first.
No, it's been suggested that, and this gets to your second dot point there, that the spread of SSRIs, that is to say selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants if you like, is responsible for the drop in violence. So have you got an immediate reaction to that or thought about that? I mention this because the homicide rate's been falling for a long time now and well before the gun buyback. Do you think there are situational factors that might have caused that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's one of the big dilemmas in explaining the so-called worldwide crime drop, isn't it? That it's easier to explain it for property crime than it is for violent crime. Not really, but it's a good thought. I could actually troll through the data again and find if there's anything that bears on that. I don't know, Don. How would you test that really? I could say it sounds plausible.
Well, I suppose a randomised trial's out of the question.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing that's been suggested here is that, I don't know whether you've read the Murder in Medicine paper, that the same number of people are being attacked, but fewer of them are dying because emergency medical procedures have improved so much, especially after the Vietnam War. But have you got a reaction to that suggestion?
Well, our data certainly don't speak to that. We don't have attempted murders here or manslaughter, ones that didn't lead to death. Look, all of these just sound like hypotheses that you could bring up lead if you wanted to. Everyone brings up lead.
Richard, I've always tried to make you speculate and I've never succeeded. Today's no different.
I fear I'd be going beyond the data. On the other hand, maybe I'll trawl through it again and see if we can dig something up. Sorry to be so wishy-washy.
I was just wondering if you looked at persons who had been found not guilty by reason of mental illness or had manslaughter, substantial impairment, and also just spinning off from that, whether you looked at just mental illness.
Certainly not in this aspect. We only got people who were found guilty of homicide, but if you look at some of the stories, a small number did claim that they were suffering mental illness at the time, or they suffered mental illness. I haven't split those data off at this point, and we haven't in the larger study either. There's a massive amount of data that we've collected. These interviews went for sometimes 2 to 3 hours. The life course one in particular, the year diary, has just enormous amounts of information that we've still to trawl through. I'm going to be as wishy-washy with you as I'm afraid as was Don.
I just think maybe it's a future study you should look at, because from my perspective there's an overwhelming number of people with mental illness who are being charged with murder, and I'd also say that it's not just the intimate partners, but parents and children.
Our sample, to the extent that I've looked at it, seemed to make a clear distinction between being generally okay but losing their temper or losing control. A relatively small number sort of called that mental illness, or said what they were suffering at the time was mental illness.
Yes, but that's because those ones have already been hived off.
Yeah, they're not in our sample.
I think there's time for one more question.
I'm really interested in the role of drugs and alcohol, and whether you looked into that as to whether or not those people self-identified as having long-term dependencies, or whether it was more of a issue of the inhibition loss, or in that particular incident. What was sort of a characteristic?
Yeah, again, we certainly looked at that in the first stage of the study, the more static measures. I haven't joined those data with these data. What I was interested in here really was how that day unfolded, what happened on the day. Again, there's work to be done, I guess, to looking at how that panned out over the year before, which you can look at through the event calendar, but then the measures of alcohol consumption that we've taken in the first set of the study. I'm sorry, I just can't present all of the data in one talk.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
There's
thank
probably
you.
more questions at